There. Well, my name is Stephanie Plunkett. I'm Deputy Director and Chief Curator, and we really have an exciting event today. We're really thrilled to have Jame Warhola with us, who is an outstanding illustrator, designer, and also the nephew of a very famous artist, Andy Warhol. And if you've been in our galleries, we actually are fortunate to have two Andy Warhol artworks in an exhibition called Rockwell and Realism in an Abstract World, which kind of looks at how abstraction in the mid-20th century really impacted both the world of fine art as well as the world of illustration. But we're thrilled to have Jame with us today to share a little bit of his background, and I'd like to tell you about him because he has done so much amazing work, and much of it will be work that's probably recognizable to you. Born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Jame Warhola was greatly influenced during his childhood by his artistic family, especially his famous uncle, pop artist Andy Warhol. From an early age of watching his uncle illustrate shoes, Jame wanted to be an illustrator. Like his uncle, he attended art classes at the Tim O'Shanter School of Art, and he graduated from Carnegie Mellon University. A move to New York City allowed him to hone his painting skills at the Art Students League, which is actually where Norman Rockwell studied as well, and so many other noted artists. Since then, and being in New York, he was able to develop a career as a freelance illustrator and graphic designer. Jame's interest in science fiction, fantasy, and comics landed him in the middle of the publishing world. He established himself as a highly sought-after talent, illustrating over 300 book covers for the most prominent writers of the day. These and many other fantastical images opened other doors. In 1980, the editors at Mad Magazine commissioned him for their paperbacks. This led to him becoming a regular contributor of the magazine ever since. Another related achievement was being selected as one of the primary artists for the very popular Garbage Pail Kids card series. Do you remember the Garbage Pail Kids? In 1987, an art director handed Jame a children's book manuscript, instructing him to do as he pleased with it. It was called The Pumpkinville Mystery, which became an instant Halloween favorite. He has since illustrated over 30 books, several of which he has written himself. These works have garnered him several state awards for Best Children's Book and an International Reading Association's Award for Best Nonfiction Picture Book for his autobiographical story, Uncle Andy's. Sequels to this wonderful tale include Uncle Andy's Cats, and both books were inspirations for our program today. And in fact, if you'd like to take home a signed copy, we do have them in the museum store, and Jame will be signing copies after the program. Jame Warhola has also been featured nationally on NPR's Weekend Edition, All Things Considered, and Fresh Air, and I'm thrilled to announce that we are going to be having an exhibition of his work here at the Norman Rockwell Museum next summer, along with an interesting installation that pairs Norman Rockwell and Andy Warhol as important American image makers during the 20th century. So we thank you all for coming, and welcome to Jame Warhola.
Thank you, Stephanie. That was a wonderful introduction, and I'm thrilled to come here and speak to speak to an audience and tell them a little bit about my life and life as an illustrator. And of course, it couldn't happen in a better place than Norman Rockwell's museum, which, along with my fellow illustrators, he's always been an incredible idol and just a fantastic artist, technically, and also substantially what he had done in the world of communication, graphic communication. I mean, so I couldn't be in a better place and have better appreciation for my artwork, because I always like to do art illustration projects that required a sense of humor. I didn't want to go into advertising so much. I stayed in the area of publishing, and halfway through my career, I ended up in the children's book period, or area, mostly kids' picture books, which was a fabulous area for artists, because what's wonderful about the children's books is they come in all different types of styles, and the stories are vast. I mean, they could be fictional, they could be non-fictional, they could be classics, holiday stories, or they could be something that one dreams up. One person can dream up a whole story, illustrate it, and I always have equated it to the making a movie. You don't have to have thousands of people working on your movie. You could just be one person. You could write, edit it, and come up with the sketches and do the pacing and create this wonderful book. So I'm going to just kind of flip through some of the things that will help me talk about my illustration and my career. And I might go through some of these pretty quickly, but these are some of the book covers and their jackets. They were wraparounds. I did a number of classics, like the Tinderbox, which was a Hans Christian Andersen story. The Brave Little Tailor, which was a Brothers Grimm story about a little guy beating all these giants in a very clever way. That was my cover. And I did more contemporary stories like Silly Days on the Farm. Like this was called Well I Never, where there's floating pigs. And this is one of my, believe it or not, this is one of my hits. I guess he sells good in Texas. It's called Bubba the Cowboy Prince, and it's basically a Cinderella story, but featuring a young boy instead of a girl. By the same author, I did this one called Aunt Hilarity's Bustle, about this young girl creating a bustle back in the 1800s when she saw it in a magazine, and she said she just had to have one. But she lived out in the middle of the Midwest, and so she constructed this bustle that got her into all kinds of trouble. And of course, another Cinderella story, but this one's called Bigfoot Cinderella. So you could picture my process. I'm always laughing as I'm working because I just love stories with a sense of humor. If You Can Hop Like a Frog. That was more of a non-fictional mathematic book. And if written by the same author, David Schwartz, If Dogs Were Dinosaurs. Actually, that's since I live in the area. I live over near Rhinebeck. So I used the corner Rhinebeck shop. It was a tobacco shop in Rhinebeck, and I figured, well, it's perfect. It's a perfect kind of backdrop to my book cover. So a lot of times I draw and paint locally and to get material. So, and of course, I had the good fortune of working with the old Mayor Koch. You remember Mayor Koch of New York? Well, in his retirement, he was very active. He wrote books, and he was very. He kept contact with his old political connections in New York, and he and his sister, who was I think she was more the writer than he was, even though he had written a few books. They came up with this story, and they commissioned me to be the illustrator, and that was a lot of fun. It was just basically how he got into the politics of being mayor of New York, and it was basically because he was a good talker. Really, and that he wasn't good at sports. As you can see, he couldn't play sports, but he wanted to be good at sports. But his brother told him, why don't you do something you're good at? And he says, what am I good at? Well, I'm good at talking. And sure enough, he was good at talking. You remember he'd say, how am I doing? How am I doing? But he was a wonderful guy to meet in person. He only passed away just 3-4 years ago. But very tall gentleman. And I met him a few times, took notes, and ran my sketches through to him and the editors and his sister. His sister is wonderful too. If you're happy and you know it. So That's like just like the song, like on the wheels on the race car. Well, this is kind of if you're happy and know it. And there I did do a book, The Wheels on the Race Car. It's a little like the wheels on the bus. And you know what? It's funny. It's the one time I came up with this story with a friend of mine living. He was a neighbor, and we tried to sell this book. And I did real drivers in the car. And we couldn't sell it. But when I turned all the drivers into animals, I got a publisher to, hey, let's do this book. It's good. I had fun doing that. And there's this is the witch in that book, The Tinderbox. She was like, and this is one of the big dogs that he encounters. He encounters dogs with eyes as giant wagon wheels, or as giant moons, I think. And of course, there's the brave little Tailor. But before I got into kids' books, I did a lot of paperback covers. And that's when I studied at the Art Students League. Of course, as Stephanie said, Norman Rockwell studied at the Art Students League, as well as many other well-known artists studied there. I mean, the Art Students League in New York was a fantastic art school. A little bit less regimented than a college. Colleges were more regimented, but the Art Students League, you can go and you could pick your instructor. Even a lot of famous artists, like modern artists, went there, like Jackson Pollock. Can you imagine? Can you imagine him and Rockwell side by side, maybe? Except I think Jackson Pollock would be a little younger than Norman. Norman was already out probably 20 years before Jackson Pollock got there. But anyway, I learned how to paint, and I found out from all my painting friends that the place to go was the paperback world. The paperback world was an incredible place for young artists to make a living. You didn't have to do anything else. You could just get the manuscripts, paint one image that would represent the whole book, and you could pick your genre. You could pick westerns, you could pick science fiction, fantasy, and you could even pick romance or horror. It's like all kinds of areas. And it provided careers for many artists all through, like let's say paperback goes back to like 1930, 1920 maybe, or thereabouts, and came all the way up. Now they use a lot of digital art, so there's not as many artists doing paperback covers. And also people aren't reading as much as they used to. They're reading on their Kindles and things like that. So the paperback market is not what it used to be. But for a long time, it was a great area. And that's what I did. I did mostly science fiction and fantasy. That was one of my first covers. Philip Jose Farmer, very well-known science fiction writer, collection of his stories. And I envisioned him at his typewriter on Mars with all his characters around him. And there's just a portion of some of the books that I've done. A lot of young adult books. A lot of young adults. I mean, teenagers would read science fiction a lot. I mean, I liked it. It was kind of exciting. Of course, they paid if they published a lot of books, they would pay you more. Science fiction and fantasy was kind of a little bit on the lower side. If I was to do romance, I'd be getting 3 times the price, because romances were very popular. And this is the most well-known writer that I illustrated was Robert Heinlein, and he's famous for that book called Stranger in a Strange Land, and that's the centerpiece there. Of course, he also did Starship Troopers, and they made a TV series out of it. And these are the Choose Your Own Adventure books. I did a lot of those, where it was kind of a clever, kind of a gimmick. I'll call it a gimmick, where you choose your own ending as you go through a book, and it was just to keep kids more interested in reading. And a lot of boys would buy these books, and you'd go all through the book, and it was fully illustrated also, but I didn't do the interiors, I only did the covers. That was like a collection of shorts, it's a movie review book of horror films, I think. That's what it was. What was that? Yeah, creature feature movie guide book. So, got all my friends together, They didn't pay for for the models, like the romance covers. Those artists, they got paid for like real models, and they got paid for costumes and all that. I just had to gather all my friends and hire them and say, okay, we're going to do a shoot tonight, and it's for my creature feature book. So these are all my friends, and I'm Dracula, and it worked out. You kind of made it work. That was a good old friend of mine who does comics. Serious science fiction there. Collection of stories about magic. And I did all these in oils. There again, studying Norman Rockwell's painting. I mean, you could learn a lot by just looking at the surface of his paintings. And we couldn't find enough of Norman Rockwell's paintings all through New York. Sometimes there'd be shows. We'd go and, examine them. And he had a great way of vibrating color. And he was academically trained, so he could paint. So, and that was a science fiction book. It's actually the first cyberpunk book by William Gibson called Neuromancer. I did a lot of Wizard Workshop kind of paintings. And alien barroom paintings too. Ever since Star Wars, the cantina scene, I was doing like these, it's just like grueling to do all that detail, but it was fun. And Alfred E. Newman. Somebody recommended me to the mad people. They said, he painted a good Frankenstein. Maybe he can do Alfred as Frankenstein. So I went over there. And of course, it was run by this guy. His name was Bill Gaines, and he had this really long white hair, and he sat in his office. He's heavy set. And he looked and, yeah, okay, could give him a try. And they gave me the job. And sure enough, he liked it. And I continued doing work for them. And I did probably a dozen or so covers for them over the years, and a lot of interiors. Of course, you might not see it, but it still is published, but very, very minimally as far as, like most magazines. They've been, ending. Their lives are, shortened because now it's all internet. They don't sell enough magazines to keep them going. And, they cut the rates for what they pay the artists and the writers. But they still publish, but only like 8 issues a year when they used to publish 20 issues a year. So they still put it out, but it's tough for the magazine world for these magazines to survive. It's just not, they don't sell enough to make it worth it. And I don't think they've cultivated the internet like website to kind of in a way that they could make money off of it. Just like newspapers, they still can't figure out how to survive. So there's some of my mad covers. Oh, I did Dracula too. A well-known artist, his name was Norman Mingo, and he did a lot of the early covers. They had a Norman Rockwell quality to them, and he was really a great painter. But he did a book cover called, it was called Mad Sucks, I think. So this was Son of Mad Sucks. And they sometimes gave me these difficult ones. I mean, oh my gosh. I mean, how do you paint something like that? Well, I had to paint the hand, and I painted I pasted in all the letters and everything, but and this was supposed to be a scratch and sniff issue. And Actually, they wanted to make the whole issue smell like lemon, but they found out it was highly volatile when it went through the printing or drying. So they just made it a scratch and sniff, where you scratch Alfred and you know, smell something. I don't know what, but of course, the Garbage Pail Kid cards. On this, this was kind of weird because somebody called up at MAD and they said, they wanted to know if we had any artists that can work for Topps because they're short of artists. So they sent me out to Brooklyn to the Topps bubblegum factory where they do the baseball cards and stuff, but they did them out in Brooklyn in this weird old factory, you know, neighborhood. And I didn't know what I was getting myself into because I didn't know anything about them, but they were published for about a year before I got wind of it, and they were really obnoxious cards. I mean, a lot of, you know, just they had a kind of a repulsive aspect, you know, bodily fluids and snots and you name it. You know, it was like they were selling these, and the kids loved it. So, who was the art director was Art Spiegelman. If you are familiar with his book called Mouse, I mean, he's an underground cartoonist who used to work for Topps Bubblegum. So I was working with Art Spiegelman and his partner out at Topps. I'd go out for once a week, and I did about 100 of these cards. Altogether, I think they published about 600 cards. It was fun. It was kind of strange. It was probably the most mass-produced commercial thing I ever did, you know, as far as like them going all through the country. And we're back to Bubba. And these are just some of the interiors. I'll flip through them quickly, but this is just an example how you go from sketch to the final art, but there's a lot of stuff that happens in between. These are the initial like thumbnail drawings. And developing characters, which is fun. That's why I tell all my young, like when I go to schools, I tell kids that if you do a lot of drawing, you can't help but get better at it. And it really requires, I mean, drawing is fun, and it can take you places. Like nowadays, it might not be illustration as we know it, like with magazines, but it could be film, animation, it could be video games, it could be, you know, anything that happens on the internet. But there's still a lot of need for artists. Artists are required for designing things. Everything in this world is designed. They have to start somewhere. I mean, some people can draw on a computer. I don't know how to do that yet, but you know. I like working with pen, pencil. I was developing the Bigfoot Cinderella's sisters. There's the Mrs. Or I mean, yeah, no, this is the Cinderella herself. There's the Bigfoot Prince, and just kind of developing the book. Like this was somebody else's story. It was about 10 pages long. I had to, you know, design the book out, the pacing, the climactic moments, and I did this particular book in oils, but most of my kids' books are done in watercolor. I always heard that watercolor was a good medium for kids' books. Oh, there I am. I don't know. You see, I haven't reviewed my PowerPoint presentation for quite a while, and I'm not sure who was my last audience. Anyway, I come from Pittsburgh. I throw some of these images in, and I had this famous uncle. I mean, who would think? And of course, a lot of people didn't know Andy Warhol's name was Andrew Warhola. He dropped the A, but he was also from Pittsburgh. And by the time I came along in 1955, he was already in New York working as a successful illustrator. And we would come and visit from Pittsburgh. He lived with his mother. His mother moved to New York with him, or she came up a little later to join him because both the other brothers got married, and he was the only one left that didn't get married. So she came up. And she missed her grandkids a lot, and my parents made a point of driving up there at least 4 or 5 times a year. Every 2 months, we would be making a trip up to New York. So we were always extremely excited. I did this little drawing as a birthday card. Now, I didn't know I did it until my sister saw it at the Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh. And she says, "Hey, Jamie, you know what? They won't believe it, but there's a birthday card here that you did, and it's in the showcase." I said, "Oh, really? Take a picture of it." And apparently he was doing all his soup cans, and he had them all through his studio, and it was his birthday, and maybe somebody suggested me do a soup can for a birthday card, and he kept it. He kept it in his file, and it ended up at the museum. Yeah, he kept everything. It's amazing how much stuff. He kept all his illustration work. Of course, I became an illustrator because I used to watch him illustrate shoes, and that, as Stephanie had said, he'd be up late at night, have a big pile of shoes next to him, and he was really good at drawing. It was like magic. And of course, he had done that for about 10 years. He studied a little bit of illustration in college at Carnegie Tech. And when he came to New York, I think I might, that's how we used to show up at his doorstep. That's my first book about Uncle Andy's. Now, let's see here, what do I have there? Oh yeah, and that's the sketches for the books before I got to the final painting. Yeah, that's the sketch for the cover. I throw these in, they're just working drawings. And there's all my siblings. Myself, I'm right kind of toward the end on the later Jamie. Anyway, you know, he was this eccentric artist, and it's hard, when you see my dad and him side by side, you'd never think they came from the same family, you know. My dad was 8 years older, and he was kind of a gruff guy, you know. He worked in the steel mills, and he did all kinds of labor jobs. And he, you know, at some point he decided, I don't like working for anybody, so he started his own junkyard. And that was our life, working in my dad's junkyard. And then he'd say, "Oh, let's go up and visit Bubba and Uncle Andy in New York." And we'd say, "Oh, great, let's go." And my uncle would be living in his own world up there with his mother. And we just kind of accepted it. You didn't never think that, gee, Andy came from Pittsburgh and he had this similar upbringing as my dad did. You know, kind of poor. You know, in the suburb of, well, it's the little neighborhood of Pittsburgh is called Oakland, and that's where he grew up. Anyway, my brothers and sisters still can't believe how famous Uncle Andy has become. I mean, he was really famous when we were young as an illustrator. He was a big hit with us, and he was also wealthy. He got to buy his own house. And then he started doing those soup cans, which that's what our place looked like in Pittsburgh. It looked like a junkyard, you know. It was out in the country, and there's my dad driving his truck. So that's part of the story. Now, I asked my dad. He passed away about 2.5 years ago, but he'd always tell us Andy stories. But I said, at one point about when I first did the book, I said, "Dad, did you ever call ahead when you were going to load us all up in the car and show up at his doorstep?" And he said, "Oh, no, of course not. That would ruin the surprise." So that's how I got the idea for the book. I figured, well, it's going to be about my dad, the junk man, and my Uncle Andy, the famous artist. But there's something there, you know. But then it just developed into a book about the trips that we used to take. And of course, my brothers and sisters are very proud of having this book out there because it tells our story. Anyway, he'd come home and we'd go and, you know, like be all happy and go up to New York and load our station wagon up. And of course, when we got there, they said, "Oh, don't leave anything in the car because they steal everything." So we would unload the whole car, because we didn't want to get anything stolen. And my dad would always bring something from the junkyard. And I remember him bringing this giant magnet with all these bolts. And my uncle was it was not too difficult to impress him because he loved everything. And he would just have fun, like receiving these gifts, these junky gifts. Here's a picture of my dad and my Uncle Andy. When my uncle was 15, before he went to college, my dad had, I got to say that he had a creative streak in him also. He was almost like a frustrated artist. So I was just not influenced by my Uncle Andy, but also my dad. My dad was more, I guess, bohemian and his kind of avant-garde, maybe. He was always thinking off the chart. And I did this cross-section of the house, which was kind of interesting. He bought this house on 89th and Lex. As I remember, I heard he bought it for $60,000 in 1960. And there he is. And of course, my mother, she was just trying to take care of the kids. There's 7 kids, she'd come into a room and she'd just see clutter everywhere. And she'd say, "Gee, Andy, when are you going to get rid of all this stuff?" So she and my uncle, they always had a little bit of friction between them. They were kind of like, she had no problem, like sometimes, maybe she wasn't aware that she was insulting him, Of course, he used to give my dad all his old wigs, and we'd take them home to Pittsburgh, and play, just have fun with them. My dad would put them on, and he put them on really as a joke. He really, and there's my uncle. We'd be running out the door selling a soup can, and there I am. I have my own studio. Now, the follow-up book I had was Uncle Andy's Cats. There's a picture of him on the steps. I always bring a soup can to my talks. This is a replica of a soup can that he gave to our family, and we had since sold it many years ago. It was a gift to all my brothers and sisters and myself, and I did a copy of it. But that particular soup can he gave us, we would take this skull, like each of us. We would take the skull, not this one, this replica, but we would take the original skull. So it was like show and tell. And everybody was impressed, and they touch it. And they say, "This is a soup can that I painted." Now I don't know how kids appreciate. They always appreciated it, but I don't know if they really understood it. I don't even think we understood it, but we just knew that he was famous for painting soup cans, like painting an ordinary object. So I bring my soup can, that I painted. I painted this maybe about 40 years ago, and I let kids touch it. It's not in a museum on a wall, but this is an exact copy of the one we had that we used to take to school. And so I figured I'd bring my soup can for everybody who wants to see it when I sign a book. So, and of course, if you had a soup can today, it'd be worth a lot of money. Just to let you know, when my uncle was doing this, and he still had his illustration friends, and he was breaking into fine art. I had heard a few times that he tried to give soup cans away as gifts. And a lot of his friends kind of, "That's okay, Andy. You just keep doing them. Maybe they're important." So a lot of Andy's friends refused his gifts for the soup cans. Of course, these soup cans are worth $10 million today. I mean, and the most famous set of soup cans. Well, I guess, let's see. I don't know if I guess I don't have them here. The most famous set of soup cans, there's 32 varieties. It was bought by his first gallery, and they were donated to the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Now, they weren't donated. They bought them. Supposedly, they paid $15 million for them, for the whole collection. But they kept them together, and they were the first set of soup cans. But there's there's about a dozen individual soup cans floating around. And then he did big ones. He did torn label ones. I mean, they were all through his studio, and we'd be, flying through the studio looking at these things, and there was pictures of money, all the pop art images that you're used to. Of course, he had a lot of Marilyns. The Marilyns he did there at his house. See, this is before the so-called silver factory. His factory, his home was his first factory. So it was kind of exciting. I mean, that's why we think back to this period of witnessing him doing all this stuff on his own. He didn't have anybody helping him silkscreen at home. It's only when he was doing really large paintings he needed to get a bigger space outside the house. So at that point he got this place called the factory. He called it the factory, and that's the stories you hear about his, all the people that used to visit him and the people that he had working for him, the eccentrics, the actors, all the strange stories. That was at the factory. But his home life was pretty ordinary. He'd come home. He wouldn't bring any of that home. In fact, he kind of kept his home life separate from his professional life. His professional life was kind of like we were lucky enough to visit him a few times at the factory, but he was always hard at work, like it was a factory. There was no parties, Not when we were there. I always remember him hard at work, I guess maybe later on in the late evenings, that's when the parties happened. And there he is, mild-mannered illustrator, hitting the streets. And he was successful from the very beginning. So I loved his illustration work. A lot of people don't realize that he could draw very well. And I'll just flip through some of this illustration work, but this is what inspired me the most, more so than the soup can. He had a beautiful way of illustrating. His special technique, and I'm not sure if he may have not invented it, but it's called the blotted ink technique, where he would draw, and before the ink dried, he would blot it. And it created a line that was very wonderful. A lot of the art directors loved this line. It was like it was being reprinted in some way. Did he record albums? A lot of record albums, but a lot of the jazz album covers, that were kind of very contemporary looking. They weren't traditional looking. Shoes, there's the shoes. The famous store in New York was called I. Miller. I. Miller was the very famous shoe store. They had a few different stores there, and I think they were rather expensive. Of course, he loved cats because we would go up there and there'd be tons and tons of cats. And that's me working at my studio over there in Tivoli. And I have an assistant. So I finished with that one because it's my dog, my corgi dog. I have two of them, except she passed away about a year ago. So anyway, I'm willing to take any questions. In a little short while, I'll do a signing. I usually do a little doodle. Because signatures are boring, aren't they? So I usually do a little drawing, and I'm more than happy to meet any of you. And if any of you want to tell me any stories, my uncle was very accessible in New York City because I'm always hearing stories about, I saw Andy on 43rd and 5th Avenue, and he gave me a copy of Interview magazine, and I mean he was really very prolific and. He loved his art. He loved doing art. He worked hard at it too. I mean, he had help, but he was always down at his studio working day and night, But I mean, his world touched every area of the arts. I mean, whether it was music or film. I mean, he was into it all. So, but anyway, does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask? Okay. Well, his first cat came from. He knew the housekeeper of Gloria Swanson's. So he was into the Hollywood thing, and when he found out that this woman was her housekeeper, she had a litter of kittens, and he asked if he could have one of the litters. So the first cat he got was from Gloria Swanson, and it was a Siamese cat. And then they decided to get another cat, and they multiplied. So at one time there were at least 20 cats. So I guess they didn't have birth control back then for cats. But maybe the tall tale aspect is maybe him getting him adopted out, and it's like I kind of exaggerated a few elements of that story, but there were a lot of cats, and he did do a cat book. It was called 25 Cats Named Sam and One Blue Pussy, which was Hester, the cat from Gloria Swanson, and my grandmother also did a cat book. So they did those cat books, and they were very limited to like 100 copies each, and unfortunately we used them as coloring books and kind of disposed of them. They're if you ever come across one of them, they're like worth as much as a house. So we can only chuckle about it now, It's just those things. Yes? Well, he was very he was very talkative with us. He wasn't shy, but that's family. He'd always ask us what we were up to, and he'd always take an interest in what we were doing. But he also was, if we were up to some mischief of some sort, he would yell at us. He'd say, "Okay, come on, kids, get out of here. Here, I gotta get a job for you." And he'd give us a job to do, or he'd give us $5 to go down on the street to get a model. My brother and I were always, into models, so he'd get us out of the house. But he had a sense of humor too. He was always buying us little, knickknacks from the magic stores. Little cameras that had birds that came out of the, or all those little things that would be fun for little boys. I mean, he could be a little bit whiny, I guess. I mean, but in general, and he really, I think I got a sense that he was very particular. If you were doing artwork for him, he was very particular about it. I mean, he did have an assistant sometimes come in, Nathan Gluck, and help him with his illustration work. And I think he was like, particular in how he liked something done. So I don't know. That's about his temperament. I mean, he was pretty.
He just doesn't strike me as the person that would have 7 kids around him for some reason.
Oh yeah, but you know what? I think there was a side of Andy that was childlike. I think he actually communicated and had more fun with us than his brother or his sister-in-law. I think he liked us kids around a lot. I think. I got a sense of that. But of course, 5 days of us being there. I mean, he probably got tired of it. Yes, there was a question back here. Yeah. Well, he knew I was interested in art from a young age, and I told him, like in high school, that I was going to go to Carnegie Mellon. At the time when he went, it was called Carnegie Tech. He tried to he told me that illustration was a dying art. And he was kind of correct, because the 60s, they were using a lot more photography. And so he was giving me the big picture. Like, as a career, it's probably not that great an idea that I should go into filmmaking or photography. And of course, I didn't listen to him. And I went into illustration anyway, because there was always room for illustration. I mean, even if you don't get paid as much as you used to in the 50s. I mean, a lot of illustrators made a lot more money back in the 50s and the 60s. I mean, even Norman Rockwell, for Saturday Evening Post covers. I mean, he got paid really well, and but it slowly, the salaries went down, and because the photography basically replaced everything. He did show me how to stretch canvases, how to mix paint. He introduced me to painting. So he was pretty good about that. I like that. Anyway, yeah, that was his advice. Stay out of art. Any more questions?
James, we thank you for such a wonderful.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Thank you. It's a pleasure. Maybe I'll see you upstairs.